a black female billionaire, fresh off a week of groundbreaking business deals, was ready to board her flight home. But as she stepped onto the plane, everything took a shocking turn. A racist airline captain targeted her without cause, demanding she leave her first-class seat and humiliating her in front of stunned passengers. Just 10 minutes later, the captain faced an unexpected consequence that left everyone speechless. What she did next changed everything and sparked a series of events no one could have predicted. Stay with me, this is a story you don't want to miss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. The airport thrummed with a steady rhythm of movement and sound, voices mingling with the hum of luggage wheels on polished floors. The crisp announcements echoing overhead. Dr. Naomi Carter stood in the middle of it all, a striking figure of composure amidst the chaos. Her tailored suit, sharp as her intellect, carried a quiet statement. Here was a woman who had earned her place. Naomi had boarded countless flights before. This one was no different, or so it seemed. Her first-class ticket felt like a promise of respite after a long week of negotiations, speeches, and business deals. It was the kind of week that left her drained yet invigorated, knowing she was breaking barriers as one of the few black women in her field to reach this level of success. But airports had a way of reducing even the most dignified of people to mere passengers, ticket holders, and seat assignments shuffled like cards in an impersonal deck. And though Naomi never sought attention, she knew how her presence could command it. She saw the way people glanced at her, their eyes flicking to her dark skin, her deliberate walk, and the designer bags slung over her shoulder. She was used to it. Years of navigating rooms where she was often the only person of her race had taught her to brace herself for curiosity, skepticism, or outright dismissal. As Naomi approached the gate, the employee stationed there, a young woman in a crisp uniform, offered a perfunctory smile. "Good afternoon," Naomi said, extending her boarding pass. The employee scanned it but frowned slightly. "Just a moment, ma'am." Her tone was polite but clipped, the kind of tone reserved for when something wasn't quite right. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Is there a problem?" The employee hesitated, glancing at the screen and then at Naomi. Her face betrayed a flicker of uncertainty before she responded. "I need to call a supervisor. Please wait here." Naomi's brow furrowed. She stepped aside but remained upright, her confidence unshaken. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, a familiar unease stirred. She had learned to sense when situations were about to take a turn. Moments later, a man emerged from the adjacent gate, a tall figure in a sharp uniform, his strides purposeful. Captain Rick Thompson carried himself with the air of authority, his face betraying an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, but one that spoke of decisions already made. He approached Naomi with a brisk nod. "Dr. Carter, is it? I understand there's been a misunderstanding with your ticket." "A misunderstanding?" Naomi repeated, her voice calm but edged with skepticism. She extended her boarding pass again. "This is a first-class seat I reserved and paid for. Perhaps there's an error in the system?" Captain Thompson didn't take the ticket. Instead, he folded his arms, his posture stiff. "Unfortunately, we're going to need you to relinquish that seat. It's been reassigned." Naomi felt the first ripple of something sharper than unease, something closer to anger. She kept her voice even, but her eyes locked on his. "I don't understand. This ticket is valid, and I boarded early to ensure there were no issues. Why is my seat being reassigned?" The captain's gaze faltered for a moment before hardening. "It's a matter of protocol," he said, the words clipped and final. "We've had to make adjustments for other passengers." Naomi's stomach tightened. The implication hung in the air like a shadow. Other passengers, adjustments. Her mind flickered to the unspoken rules she had navigated all her life, the coded language that turned inclusion into exclusion without ever stating the obvious. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice sharper now, "but I don't see why I should be displaced from a seat I rightfully reserved. Surely there are other adjustments you can make." The captain's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm not going to argue with you. If you refuse to comply, I'll have to call security." Around them, passengers began to notice. Whispers floated through the air, eyes darting between Naomi and the captain. Some faces bore curiosity, others judgment. Naomi felt the weight of those stares pressing against her. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about something far deeper, Far uglier. I'm not causing a scene, Naomi said firmly. You're the one creating an issue where there shouldn't be one. I'll happily remain seated in the seat I paid for. Captain Thompson took a step closer, his presence imposing. I don't care who you are, he said quietly, but his words were laced with steel. You're going to leave that seat, or I will have you removed. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Naomi's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. Her voice dropped, cold and deliberate. If you touch me, you'll regret it. The captain's face flushed. He motioned toward the gate agent, who quickly picked up a phone. Naomi realized then that she wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing against something far bigger. The quiet assumptions, the silent judgments, the systemic belief that she didn't belong in the space she had earned. As the murmurs grew louder, the captain finally snapped. His hand shot forward, gripping her arm and pulling her out of the aisle. The action was swift but deliberate, enough to unbalance her momentarily. Gasps erupted from the surrounding passengers, their whispers escalating into audible shock. Naomi stumbled but caught herself, straightening immediately. Her voice, steady as a rock, cut through the chaos. Get your hands off me. The captain didn't respond. He turned toward the gate, barking for security as though he hadn't just crossed a line. Naomi's breath came in shallow bursts, but she refused to let the humiliation take hold. She straightened her shoulders and stared him down, her voice carrying over the noise. This is unacceptable, she declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. And I will not forget it. The crowd's murmurs became a low roar, passengers exchanging glances of disbelief. Some held their phones, filming the encounter. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears as two security officers approached. Her mind raced, balancing her anger and her strategy. She wouldn't let them paint her as the aggressor. She wouldn't let them reduce her to a footnote in her own story. And as she was escorted off the plane, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just a flight. This was a reckoning waiting to happen. The terminal was a cacophony of voices and movement. But for Dr. Naomi Carter, everything seemed muted, as if she were encased in a bubble of disbelief. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she was escorted away by two security officers, their presence a silent proclamation of authority. The eyes of passengers trailed her, some wide with curiosity, others averted with discomfort, and a few clouded by quiet judgment. Naomi held her head high, though her mind churned with indignation. She wasn't new to the subtle, insidious ways the world could remind her she didn't belong. She had fought against it in boardrooms, at conferences, even at dinner parties where polite smiles often masked unspoken bias. But this being manhandled off a plane she had every right to be on felt like a culmination of those unspoken tensions, boiling over into something undeniable. Once they reached a quieter part of the terminal, the officers stopped. The younger of the two, a woman with a tight bun and an equally tight expression, cleared her throat. Ma'am, you'll need to wait here while we sort this out. Sort this out? Naomi repeated, her voice calm but taut. Exactly what is there to sort out? I have a first-class ticket, a confirmed reservation. What justification could there possibly be for what just happened? The officer hesitated, her professionalism flickering under the weight of Naomi's steady gaze. I'm afraid that's up to the airline to clarify. Ma'am, we're just here to ensure the situation remains under control. Under control? Naomi said, her voice rising slightly. The only person out of control here is that captain. And you're letting him get away with it. The second officer, older and stockier, shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, we're not here to argue. If you have a complaint, you can file it with the airline. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. A complaint? The thought almost made her laugh. Bitter and sharp, she had spent her entire life filing metaphorical complaints with her work ethic, her achievements, her unrelenting pursuit of excellence. And yet, here she was, being treated like an intruder. She turned away from the officers, pulling out her phone. The name on the screen glowed like a beacon. Dad. For a moment, she hesitated. She had built her career on independence, priding herself on solving her own problems. But this wasn't just her problem anymore. This was a battle she couldn't fight alone. Her father answered on the first ring. Naomi? His voice was deep, steady, a voice that had soothed her through childhood scrapes and celebrated her adult victories. But now, it carried an edge, as if he already sensed something was wrong. Dad, she began, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. I need to tell you what just happened. She recounted the events, each word sharpening her anger as she relived the humiliation. Her father remained silent until she finished, his measured breaths the only indication he was still on the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, simmering with controlled fury. They laid hands on you? He asked, his words deliberate, each one like the click of a lock turning. They did, Naomi said, her voice steady now. They treated me like I didn't belong there. Like I was dispensable. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken truths. Stay where you are, her father said finally. I'm making calls. This isn't going to stand. Naomi ended the call and leaned against the cold metal of a nearby bench. Around her, the terminal moved on, indifferent to her turmoil. She felt a wave of frustration, not just at what had happened but at the larger, inescapable reality it represented. How many others had been silenced in moments like this? How many had swallowed their anger because they didn't have the resources, the connections, or the will to fight back? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of heels clicking against the floor. A woman in a navy blazer, with the airline's logo pinned to her lapel, approached. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Dr. Carter, the woman began, her tone professional but guarded. My name is Sarah Daniels. I'm a supervisor with the airline. I'd like to personally apologize for what happened earlier. Naomi straightened, fixing Sarah with a piercing gaze. Apologize? Is that all you're offering after I was physically removed from a plane I had every right to be on? Sarah's composure wavered for a moment. I understand how upsetting this must be, she said carefully, and I assure you, we are looking into the matter. We value all our customers and strive to ensure. Don't, Naomi interrupted, her voice slicing through the woman's practiced spiel. Don't stand here and tell me about your values while your captain was allowed to humiliate me in front of a plane full of people. This isn't about one incident. This is about a system that let him think he could get away with it. Sarah flushed, glancing around as if hoping for an escape route. Dr. Carter, I want answers, Naomi said, her tone unyielding. I want to know why I was targeted. Was it because I'm black? Because I'm a woman? Or is it both? And I want to know what your airline plans to do about it. Sarah's discomfort deepened, but before she could respond, Naomi's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her father again. Excuse me, Naomi said, stepping aside to answer. Her father's voice came through, calm but laced with authority. I've spoken to their CEO, he said. He's aware of who you are now. And he's scrambling. But this isn't just about making them sweat. Naomi, this is about sending a message. Are you ready to take this all the way? Naomi exhaled, the weight of his words settling over her. She thought of the captain's dismissive tone, the way the officers had escorted her as if she were the problem, the silent stares of the other passengers. This wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for anyone who had ever been made to feel invisible, unwelcome, or less than. I'm ready, she said. Her voice was steady, her resolve unshakable. Let's make them regret it. As she ended the call, her gaze shifted back to Sarah, who stood awkwardly nearby. Naomi approached her, her steps purposeful, her head held high. Now, she said, her voice like a blade. Let's talk about what happens next. The air around them felt charged, the calm before a storm that was about to break. Naomi wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was preparing for a battle that would ripple far beyond the terminal walls. The airport's artificial calm seemed almost mocking as Naomi Carter stood near the terminal's wide glass windows. Her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Outside, planes taxied across the tarmac under a slate-gray sky. But inside her, a storm brewed, each passing moment feeding a growing fury. This was not just about her. This was about every quiet insult, every thinly veiled slight, and every institutional wall she had spent her life scaling. The air in her lungs felt heavier, weighted by a burden that was not hers alone to bear. Sarah Daniels, the airline supervisor, hovered nearby, her polished veneer faltering under Naomi's unyielding gaze. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the occasional ding of an overhead announcement. Sarah's lips parted as if to speak, but Naomi's voice cut through, first calm yet razor sharp. Ms. Daniels, Naomi said, her tone formal, her words measured. I'm waiting. The supervisor hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Dr. Carter, she began, her voice carefully modulated. I've escalated your concerns to our senior management. They're fully aware of the situation and are reviewing. Reviewing what? Naomi interrupted, taking a deliberate step closer. A grown man physically removed me from my seat as if I were a trespasser. What exactly requires review? Sarah flushed, visibly flustered. I understand how upsetting this is. And I assure you. No, Naomi said, her voice rising slightly, though it remained controlled. You don't understand. You may never understand what it feels like to be reduced to nothing more than your skin color in a space you've earned your right to occupy. Naomi's words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. A few nearby travelers turned their heads. Their curiosity piqued. Sarah shifted on her heels, her professional facade now a thin shield against the weight of Naomi's indignation. Before Sarah could muster a response, Naomi's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen. Dad. Excuse me, Naomi said, turning away to answer. Yes? Her father's voice came through steady but taut, carrying the weight of decades of battles fought in boardrooms and beyond. I've spoken to their CEO, he said. He's scrambling to keep this quiet. But this isn't the kind of thing that stays quiet for long. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, her grip tightening on the phone. Good, she said, because I'm not staying quiet. Marcus Carter exhaled, his tone softening slightly. I know you're angry, Naomi. You have every right to be. But you need to decide how you want to handle this. If we push too hard, they'll fight back. They'll spin this into something it's not. Naomi's jaw clenched. I'm not afraid of their spin. They can't erase what happened. Not this time. Then you need to prepare for what comes next. Marcus said, this won't just be about you. They'll use everything they can to shift the blame. You need to stay calm. Stay focused. Naomi nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I'll handle it, she said firmly. Thanks, Dad. When she turned back, Sarah was gone, replaced by another airline employee, a middle-aged man with graying hair and an air of nervous authority. He introduced himself as David Greer, the airline's regional manager. Dr. Carter, he said, extending a hand she did not take. First, let me personally apologize for what happened earlier. It was unacceptable, and we're committed to addressing it. Addressing it? Naomi echoed, her tone cold. What does that mean, exactly? Will Captain Thompson face consequences? Or is this just another hollow apology? David's discomfort was palpable. He cleared his throat, his eyes darting briefly to the ground before meeting hers again. The captain's actions are under review. I can't speak to specific outcomes. But I can assure you that the airline does not condone. Save it, Naomi snapped, cutting him off. I've heard this before. Words without action, promises without accountability. You say you don't condone this behavior. But it happened. What I want to know is what you plan to do about it. David hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her directness. Before he could respond, Naomi's phone buzzed again. This time, the screen displayed an unfamiliar number. She frowned but answered anyway. Dr. Carter? A smooth, professional voice greeted her. This is Lisa Morgan, your father's legal counsel. Mr. Carter asked me to reach out to you directly. Naomi stepped away from David, her heart quickening. Ms. Morgan, she said, lowering her voice. What's the plan? We're drafting a formal complaint against the airline, Lisa said. But I need to know if you're ready to go public. Once this story breaks, it'll draw attention, both good and bad. Naomi's stomach twisted. She had spent years building a reputation based on her work, her intellect, her resilience. The thought of becoming a public symbol, of having her life scrutinized and debated, was daunting. But then she thought of Captain Thompson's sneer, the way he had dismissed her, as if she were an obstacle rather than a person. She thought of the passengers who had watched silently, complicit in their inaction. I'm ready, she said. Good, Lisa replied. We'll handle the legal side. In the meantime, keep a record of everything, every conversation, every interaction. This is no longer just about you. It's about setting a precedent. Naomi ended the call and turned back to David, who stood awkwardly a few steps away. Her gaze was steady, unyielding. I've spoken with my legal team, she said. This isn't going away. If your airline thinks it can sweep this under the rug, you're mistaken. David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Naomi didn't wait for him to find them. She turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor with a steady rhythm that echoed her resolve. As she moved through the terminal, the stares followed her, some curious, others judgmental, but Naomi didn't falter. The fault lines of the system that had tried to break her were cracking. And she intended to widen them until they shattered. This wasn't just her fight. It never had been. And she wasn't backing down. Naomi sat in the corner of the airport lounge, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the sprawling tarmac outside. The planes moved with an unrelenting rhythm, taking off into skies that seemed unreachable. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the day in stark, unforgiving detail. Each moment the captain's cold dismissal, the firm grip of security, the averted gazes of passengers etched itself deeper into her memory. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. That much was clear. But the reality of what was to come, the inevitable maelstrom of media, legal battles, and public opinion, weighed on her. She wasn't naive. She understood how these things played out. A black woman standing up for herself in a world that often refused to see her humanity was a dangerous proposition. But Naomi had never shied away from danger when the stakes were this high. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from her father. CEO contacted me. Damage control in full swing. Call when ready. Naomi smirked bitterly. Damage control. It was always about the damage, wasn't it? Never about the cause, the root of the rot. She could imagine the sterile conference rooms where suits debated how to spin this, how to make it disappear without leaving a stain. But she wasn't going to let them wash this away. Not this time. Meanwhile, in a sleek office far removed from the chaos of the terminal, the airline's executive team was in disarray. Do we know how far this has spread? Demanded Jack Green, the CEO, his voice barely masking the panic simmering beneath his polished exterior. A young PR manager hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between her tablet and the room. It's already trending on Twitter. Hashtag Justice for Naomi is gaining traction. Local news outlets are picking up the story. Green ran a hand through his graying hair, his frustration mounting. Damn it, what about Captain Thompson? Has he been briefed? Not yet, said another executive. He's still in the air. But we've isolated the flight crew. HR is conducting interviews. Green leaned back, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This isn't just a PR nightmare. This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. And it's going to cost us. The room fell silent, the gravity of the moment palpable. The unspoken truth lingered in the air. This wasn't just about one captain or one passenger. This was about an industry built on unacknowledged biases. A system that had allowed moments like this to happen again and again, unchecked. Back at the airport, Naomi was approached by Lisa Morgan, her father's attorney, who had arrived in person. Lisa was a force of nature, her sharp features and no-nonsense demeanor making it clear she was not someone to be trifled with. She dropped into the chair across from Naomi, her briefcase landing on the table with a satisfying thud. I've spoken to their legal team. Lisa began without preamble. They're trying to frame this as a misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication. Naomi raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a humorless smile. A breakdown in communication? That's what they're calling it. Lisa nodded, her expression grim. It's predictable. They're hoping you'll settle quietly. Accept an apology, maybe some compensation, and let it fade away. And if I don't? Naomi asked, already knowing the answer. Lisa leaned forward, her tone lowering. Then they'll fight. They'll dig into your past, your career, anything they can use to discredit you. They'll frame you as difficult, disruptive, a troublemaker. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fists clenching in her lap. She had seen this play out before, not with herself, but with others, friends, colleagues, strangers whose names became headlines and then cautionary tales. The system was always prepared to defend itself, no matter the cost. Let them try, Naomi said finally. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with quiet defiance. I won't let them define me. Lisa studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good, because this isn't just about you. It never was. Hours later, Naomi's father, Marcus, arrived at the airport. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud, heavy, charged, impossible to ignore. He embraced Naomi briefly, his hands firm on her shoulders as he stepped back to study her. You holding up? He asked. I am, she replied, but I'm angry. Good, Marcus said. Anger is fuel, but don't let it burn you out. Use it. The three of them, Naomi, Marcus, and Lisa, sat down to strategize. Lisa laid out the options: a public press conference, a formal lawsuit, direct negotiations with the airline. Each choice carried risks and rewards. And none of them guaranteed justice. They're going to come after us hard, Marcus said, but we have leverage. Their reputation is already on the line. If this goes public, they'll lose more than money. They'll lose trust. Do they even care about trust? Naomi asked, bitterness creeping into her voice. Or is it just about avoiding bad press? Marcus smiled faintly. For them, trust and bad press are the same thing. But for us, it's about something bigger. This isn't just about this one flight. It's about every boardroom, every school, every workplace where people like us are told we don't belong. Naomi nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She had always admired her father's ability to see the bigger picture. To fight battles not just for himself but for everyone who came after. And now, it was her turn to do the same. As the night deepened, the media frenzy intensified. Reporters swarmed the terminal, their cameras and microphones a constant presence. Passengers from Naomi's flight began sharing their accounts, some supporting her, others parroting the airline's narrative of a misunderstanding. Naomi watched it all unfold from the lounge, her resolve hardening with every passing minute. This wasn't just about justice for herself. This was about forcing a reckoning, exposing the cracks in a system that had thrived on complacency. By the time she finally left the airport, escorted by her father and Lisa, Naomi felt the weight of what was to come. The fight wouldn't be easy. The road ahead would be long, fraught with challenges she couldn't yet anticipate. But as she stepped into the cool night air, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't afraid to fight. Not for herself, and not for the countless others whose voices had been silenced for far too long. The morning after the incident, Naomi woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. For a moment, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, letting the enormity of the day ahead wash over her. Sleep had been fleeting, her mind replaying every detail of the humiliation she had endured. But as the buzzes grew more insistent, she finally reached for her phone. The notifications were relentless: emails, texts, missed calls. The story had broken wide open. She sat up, scrolling through headlines. Prominent black businesswoman removed from first-class seat in airline dispute. Hashtag justice for Naomi trends as public outrage grows over airline incident. Racial bias in the skies. A passenger's fight for dignity. Naomi's stomach churned as she scrolled through the accompanying comments. Many were supportive, but others dripped with venom, their ugliness all too familiar. She's probably exaggerating to get attention. First class? Who's she kidding? Just another entitled troublemaker playing the race card. She exhaled slowly, fighting to steady herself. None of this was new. But that didn't make it less infuriating. It wasn't just the vitriol, it was the certainty with which strangers dismissed her experience. As though her very existence in a space of privilege was an affront. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Lisa Morgan. Naomi answered, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. Lisa, she said, how bad is it? Lisa's tone was clipped but calm. It's not just bad, it's explosive. The video of the captain forcing you out of your seat is all over the internet. Media outlets are picking it up faster than we can track. Public opinion is split. As expected. The good news is, your story is resonating. The bad news is, the airline is already in counterattack mode. Naomi frowned. What do you mean? They're trying to frame you as combative. Lisa said bluntly. Leaked statements from crew members suggest you were disruptive and refused to cooperate. It's a clear attempt to shift blame. Naomi's anger flared. Disruptive? I was sitting in my assigned seat. How is that disruptive? Lisa sighed. They're playing a calculated game. They know how these narratives work, paint you as an unreasonable, angry black woman, and they think they can discredit you. But we're ready for this. Across the city, in a nondescript conference room, the airline's crisis management team convened. Jack Green, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, his jaw tight. The air was thick with tension as his team laid out their options. We need to issue a public apology, one executive said. A real one this time. Not just the boilerplate statement we released yesterday. Acknowledge the incident, commit to an investigation, and promise change. Green shook his head. An apology isn't enough. We're facing accusations of systemic racism. If we admit fault, we open ourselves up to lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny. But if we don't act decisively, the public backlash could destroy us. The PR director countered. Naomi Carter isn't just any passenger. She's a prominent black entrepreneur with a platform and a following. She has the power to mobilize people. And she's already started. Then we need to discredit her. Green said flatly. Find anything in her past that we can use. We need to make her seem less sympathetic, less credible. The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the team. They all understood the stakes. This wasn't just about protecting their bottom line, it was about preserving a system that had gone unchecked for far too long. By midday, Naomi and Lisa were seated in a private meeting with a journalist from a prominent news outlet. The reporter, a young woman named Elena, leaned forward, her notebook poised. Dr. Carter, Elena began, her voice steady. Your story has struck a nerve with people across the country. But the airline is already pushing back, claiming you were uncooperative and disruptive. How do you respond to that? Naomi met Elena's gaze, her voice calm but firm. It's predictable, isn't it? The moment a black woman speaks up about injustice, the narrative shifts to paint her as the problem. I was sitting in the seat I paid for, a seat I earned through years of hard work. The only disruption was their decision to remove me because they didn't think I belonged there. Elena nodded, scribbling notes. What do you hope to achieve by going public with this? Naomi paused, choosing her words carefully. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows people like that captain to act with impunity. To decide who belongs and who doesn't. I want accountability not just for what happened to me, but for every person who has been dismissed, silenced, or made invisible because of the color of their skin. As the interview went live that evening, the public reaction reached a fever pitch. Supporters rallied around Naomi, sharing their own stories of discrimination and demanding accountability from the airline. Protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, their signs and chants a stark reminder that this was no longer just about one woman's experience. But the backlash was equally fierce. Pundits on certain networks called Naomi's actions an overreaction and accused her of playing the victim. Social media exploded with debates, some supportive, others viciously critical. Naomi watched it all unfold, her emotions a storm of anger, frustration, and determination. She turned to Lisa and Marcus, who were reviewing their next steps. They want to fight? Naomi said. Her voice was low but carried the weight of her resolve. Then we'll give them one. The room was hushed as Naomi Carter stood at the podium, her hands gripping its edges like an anchor. The press conference, hastily organized yet already packed with journalists, felt like a battlefield. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, their flashes a staccato rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. Behind her stood Lisa Morgan, her legal counsel, and Marcus Carter, her father, their faces a picture of solemn resolve. Naomi scanned the room, her gaze unwavering despite the nerves coiled tight in her chest. This wasn't just a moment to tell her story, it was a moment to define it. To wrest control from those who sought to distort it. My name is Dr. Naomi Carter, she began, her voice steady but low, the room leaning in to catch her words. I am a businesswoman, a philanthropist, a daughter, and a citizen of this country. But yesterday, on a plane I boarded with a first-class ticket, I was reduced to something much smaller, something far too familiar. I was made to feel like I didn't belong. Her voice grew firmer as she continued, the rhythm of her words rising like a tide. This isn't just about a seat. This is about a system that tells people like me, people who look like me, that no matter how hard we work, how much we achieve, there will always be someone ready to push us out, to remind us that the space we occupy isn't truly ours. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the cameras. Naomi glanced down for a moment, gathering herself, before looking back up. But let me make something clear, I belong. We belong, and we will not be pushed out. The words hung in the air, weighty and undeniable. As Naomi stepped back from the podium, the room erupted into questions, reporters clamoring to be heard. Lisa stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. Dr. Carter will not be taking questions at this time. Further updates will be provided as the case develops. While Naomi's words resonated with millions, the airline's response came swiftly. Within hours, a carefully worded statement appeared on their website. We deeply regret the incident involving Dr. Naomi Carter and take these allegations seriously. The airline is committed to inclusivity and equity for all passengers. A thorough investigation is underway. To Naomi, It was as hollow as it was predictable. By evening, the battle lines had been drawn. Supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity, sharing their own stories of discrimination in the skies and beyond. The hashtag Justice for Naomi trended worldwide, amplifying voices that had long been ignored. But the opposition was equally fierce. On cable news, pundits dissected Naomi's story with thinly veiled condescension. Is this really about race? One commentator mused, leaning back in his chair. Or are we seeing a case of entitlement gone wrong? She's weaponizing her identity to make a point. Another panelist argued, this is just cancel culture on steroids. Naomi watched the coverage with a mix of anger and exhaustion. The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were so predictable, so lazy in their refusal to see the truth. Her father sat beside her, his presence a steadying force. They're scared, Marcus said, his voice calm, and they should be. Naomi turned to him, her expression weary but resolute. This fight feels bigger than me. Dad, I don't even know if I'm ready for it. Marcus placed a hand on hers, his grip firm. No one's ever ready for a fight like this. Naomi, but you don't have to be ready. You just have to be willing. Meanwhile, the airline's internal investigation was underway. Captain Rick Thompson, the man at the center of the storm, was summoned to a meeting with Auer. He walked into the conference room with the confidence of a man accustomed to authority. But it faltered under the sharp gaze of the airline's legal team. Captain Thompson, began Sarah Daniels, who now sat on the other side of the table. Her earlier discomfort had been replaced by a steely professionalism. We're here to discuss the incident involving Dr. Naomi Carter. Rick leaned back in his chair, his posture defensive. There's not much to discuss. She was being disruptive and refused to comply with instructions. I did what was necessary to maintain order. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Disruptive, she repeated, her tone icy. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Rick shrugged. She questioned my authority. She wouldn't leave the seat when I asked her to. Did you verify her ticket? Sarah pressed. I didn't need to. Rick snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Her behavior spoke for itself. Sarah exchanged a glance with the legal counsel beside her, a silent confirmation of what they already knew. Captain Thompson, she said, her voice firm, your actions have placed this airline in a precarious position. Your justification doesn't align with the accounts of multiple witnesses, nor with the surveillance footage. Rick paled, his earlier bravado slipping. What are you saying? I'm saying, Sarah replied, her tone sharp as a blade, that your actions were not just unprofessional, they were discriminatory. And they've put your career, and this airline, at risk. As the day turned to night, Naomi prepared for her first television interview. It was with a respected journalist known for tackling tough topics with nuance and empathy. Sitting in the green room, Naomi felt the weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't just about telling her story, it was about challenging a narrative that had been weaponized against people like her for generations. When the cameras rolled, Naomi spoke with the same calm conviction she had shown at the press conference. But this time, she went deeper, sharing not just what happened on the plane, but what it represented. This isn't just about a single incident, she said, her voice steady. It's about the everyday indignities that so many of us endure, indignities that are dismissed, excused, or ignored. It's about the way systems of power are built to protect themselves, even at the expense of truth. Her words struck a chord, resonating far beyond the studio walls. By the time the interview aired, the public debate had reached a fever pitch. And for Naomi, there was no turning back. The next morning, Naomi awoke to the sound of protest chants rising from the street below her apartment. She pulled back the curtains to find dozens of people gathered, their signs raised high against the crisp morning sky. No more silence, one sign read, while another boldly proclaimed, "Justice for Naomi Carter." The sight struck her with equal parts pride and unease. She hadn't asked for this movement, but here it was, surging like a tide, pulling her into a battle she couldn't step away from. Her phone vibrated incessantly on her bedside table. Messages flooded in, friends, family, colleagues, even strangers offering words of support or seeking updates. But among the encouragement were messages laced with venom. Voices eager to dismiss her pain or weaponize her narrative. Stop making everything about race. You're just trying to destroy a good man's career. If you didn't act entitled, none of this would have happened. Naomi exhaled sharply, setting the phone down. The words stung not because they surprised her, but because they confirmed what she already knew. There were people who would never see her as anything other than the sum of their prejudices. In the airline's boardroom, the tension was palpable. The crisis had spiraled beyond their control, with protesters gathered outside their headquarters and the media relentlessly dissecting every move. CEO Jack Green sat at the head of the table, his face drawn as his team laid out the latest developments. "We've suspended Captain Thompson," Sarah Daniels reported, her voice clipped. "But it's not enough. Public sentiment is overwhelmingly against us. Every day we delay decisive action, we lose more trust." Green's jaw tightened. "What about the investigation? It's damning," Sarah admitted. "Witness testimonies and video evidence all corroborate Dr. Carter's account. If this goes to court, we're looking at a massive settlement and the PR fallout could cripple us." Green slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the room. "We can't let it get that far. Find a way to settle. Quietly." But it was too late for quiet. That afternoon, Naomi found herself in yet another meeting with Lisa and her father. The three sat in Marcus's expansive office, the city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lisa had just finished outlining the airline's latest offer, a settlement large enough to silence most people. But Naomi wasn't most people. "They want you to take the money and go away," Lisa said, her tone laced with disdain. "No public apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a check to sweep this under the rug." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "What happens if I say no?" Lisa exchanged a glance with Marcus, who nodded for her to continue. "If you refuse, they'll fight. They'll drag this out in court, try to exhaust you emotionally and financially. And they'll use every opportunity to discredit you." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "So they want me to choose between my dignity and my peace." "Exactly," Marcus said. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. "But they've underestimated you. This isn't just about you, Naomi. It's about everyone who's ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to accept injustice as the cost of living." Naomi nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. "Then we fight." The decision to reject the settlement sent shockwaves through the media. Headlines screamed of Naomi's defiance, and both sides of the debate grew louder. Her supporters hailed her as a beacon of courage, while her detractors painted her as a troublemaker seeking fame. But Naomi stood firm, her resolve unwavering even as the pressure mounted. Behind the scenes, Lisa and her team worked tirelessly to prepare for the legal battle ahead. They combed through every detail of the incident, building a case that exposed not only Captain Thompson's actions but the systemic failures that allowed them to happen. "This isn't just about one man," Lisa said during a late-night strategy session. "It's about a culture that normalizes this kind of behavior, that protects people like him at the expense of people like you." Naomi nodded, her exhaustion tempered by determination. "Then we need to show the world exactly what that culture looks like." Meanwhile, Captain Rick Thompson's world was unraveling. The once confident pilot now found himself at the center of a storm he had never anticipated. Suspended from his position and vilified in the press, he struggled to reconcile his actions with their consequences. In his modest suburban home, Rick sat at his kitchen table, a glass of whiskey in hand. His wife, Susan, hovered nearby, her worry etched into her features. "Why did you do it, Rick?" she asked softly. "Why did you force her out of that seat?" Rick shook his head, his gaze fixed on the table. "I don't know," he muttered. She just wouldn't listen. "Or maybe," Susan said gently, "you couldn't stand that someone like her was sitting in first class." Her words cut deeper than she intended. And Rick flinched. "That's not fair," he snapped. "I was doing my job." "Was it your job?" Susan pressed. "To judge her before you even spoke to her? To assume she didn't belong?" Rick didn't answer. He didn't have one. The night before her next press conference, Naomi sat alone in her apartment, staring at the neatly written notes she had prepared. But no matter how hard she tried to focus, her thoughts kept drifting to the weight of what lay ahead. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore, she was speaking for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or demeaned because of who they were. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Marcus stood on the other side, his presence as steadying as ever. He stepped inside, holding 2 cups of tea. "I thought you could use this," he said, handing her a cup. Naomi smiled faintly. Thanks, Dad. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Marcus spoke. You're doing something important, Naomi. Something bigger than any of us. But I need you to remember one thing. What's that? She asked. No matter how hard they fight, no matter what they say or do, you are enough, Marcus said firmly. You've always been enough. Tears pricked at Naomi's eyes, but she blinked them away, nodding. Thanks, Dad. The next day, as Naomi stepped onto the stage for her press conference, she felt the weight of countless eyes on her. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of determination. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice carrying the strength of generations who had fought before her. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a movement, and she wouldn't stop until justice was served. The courthouse was a hive of activity, its marble steps crowded with reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. Signs bobbed in the air, slogans scrawled in bold lettering, justice for all, no more silence, end systemic racism. The air was thick with anticipation, voices blending into a chorus of determination and defiance. Naomi Carter stepped out of the car with her father at her side, her expression calm but resolute. The crowd surged toward her, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. A reporter shouted, Dr. Carter, how do you feel about today's hearing? Naomi didn't answer, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Beside her, Marcus placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. His presence was both comforting and galvanizing, a reminder of the legacy she carried with her into that courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, the cold, sterile room heavy with the weight of what was at stake. The airline's legal team sat at one table, their expressions a mix of confidence and thinly veiled nerves. Captain Rick Thompson sat among them, his once proud demeanor now replaced by quiet unease. Across from them, Naomi and Lisa Morgan prepared to face a battle they knew would be fought not just with evidence, but with narratives. The judge, an imposing woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, entered the room. The gavel struck, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the crowd. This court is now in session. The hearing began with opening statements. The airline's attorney, a man with an air of calculated charm, rose first. Your Honor, he began, this case is a matter of miscommunication, not malice. While we deeply regret Dr. Carter's experience, the actions taken by Captain Thompson were in the interest of maintaining order and safety on the aircraft. Naomi clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to respond. Lisa placed a reassuring hand on her arm before standing to deliver their opening statement. Your Honor, members of the court, Lisa began, her voice steady but sharp. This is not a case of miscommunication. It is a case of systemic bias, of a captain who acted on assumptions rather than facts, and of a corporation that has perpetuated a culture where such actions are not only tolerated but normalized. Her words hung in the air, a challenge that could not be ignored. The testimony began, each witness adding a piece to the puzzle. Passengers from the flight described what they saw, the captain's brusque demeanor, the way Naomi was singled out, the humiliation etched on her face as she was removed. She wasn't disruptive, one passenger testified, her voice trembling. She was calm, composed. The captain was the one who escalated the situation. Surveillance footage was presented next. The courtroom watched as the grainy video played, showing Naomi seated in first class, holding her ticket out to the captain. His body language was dismissive, his gestures sharp and impatient. The moment he grabbed her arm, pulling her from the seat, was met with audible gasps from the audience. Naomi watched the footage without flinching, though the memory of that moment burned fresh in her mind. This wasn't just evidence, it was vindication. When Captain Thompson took the stand, the tension in the room thickened. He shifted uncomfortably under Lisa's scrutiny as she began her cross-examination. Captain Thompson, Lisa said, her tone sharp but measured. Can you explain why you did not verify Dr. Carter's ticket before asking her to leave her seat? Thompson hesitated, his eyes darting toward his attorney. I assumed there was a mistake. You assumed, Lisa repeated, her voice cutting through the silence. And what exactly led you to that assumption? The captain stammered, his composure slipping. She didn't seem like she belonged there. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of his words crashing down like a wave. Lisa let the statement linger before pressing further. Didn't belong? She asked. her tone cold. "Is that because she's black?" Thompson's face flushed. "No, that's not what I meant. But that's what you implied," Lisa said, her voice rising. "You acted not based on protocol, but on bias, a bias that humiliated Dr. Carter and stripped her of her dignity in front of an entire plane of passengers." By the time Naomi took the stand, the room was electric with tension. She sat tall, her voice steady as she recounted the events. "I wasn't disruptive," she said firmly. "I was sitting in the seat I had rightfully purchased. A seat I worked hard to afford. But that didn't matter to Captain Thompson. He didn't see a professional woman who had earned her place. He saw someone who didn't fit his idea of who belonged in first class." Her words cut through the room like a blade, leaving no room for misinterpretation. She spoke not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been dismissed, demeaned, or diminished because of their race. "I've spent my life breaking barriers," she said, her voice unwavering. "But no matter how many I break, there are always people ready to rebuild them. This case isn't just about me, it's about making sure those barriers come down for good." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled. Protesters chanted, their voices carrying messages of solidarity and defiance. The media buzzed with updates, dissecting every moment of the trial. As Naomi stepped out into the sunlight, the noise washed over her, a reminder of the growing movement her story had ignited. Marcus was at her side, his expression proud but solemn. "This isn't just a fight," he said quietly. "It's a reckoning." Naomi nodded, her resolve unshaken. "And we're just getting started." The chapter closes with Naomi standing before the crowd, her voice clear and strong as she addresses the sea of faces. This was no longer just a personal battle, it was a movement. And Naomi Carter was ready to lead it. The courtroom was quieter than Naomi expected. It wasn't silence exactly, but a tense hush, a stillness that comes only when something monumental is about to crack wide open. She could hear the faint scribble of reporters' pens, the soft shuffle of papers as attorneys made last-minute adjustments to their notes. The weight of expectation pressed on her chest, but she refused to let it break her. Naomi adjusted her posture in her seat, her father's steady presence beside her. This was the day they would begin dismantling the airline's facade. Brick by brick, this was the day they would expose the rot hidden beneath its polished surface. The morning testimony began with a passenger who had been seated a few rows behind Naomi during the flight. A middle-aged white man in a simple button-down shirt. He exuded an air of reluctant honesty as he took the stand. "Mr. Harris," Lisa began, her voice calm but commanding. "Can you describe what you observed on the flight in question?" The man hesitated, glancing at the airline's legal team before answering. "I saw the captain approach Dr. Carter. He seemed irritated, dismissive." "And did Dr. Carter appear disruptive in any way?" Lisa asked. "No," Harris replied firmly. "She was calm. She showed him her ticket. But he didn't even really look at it. He just kept telling her to leave the seat." Lisa pressed further. "And how did Captain Thompson respond when she refused?" The man's expression tightened. He grabbed her arm, pulled her out of the seat. It was shocking. Honestly, I've never seen anything like it." The airline's attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculative." The judge raised a hand. "Sustained. Stick to the facts, Mr. Harris." But the damage was done. The jury had heard enough to begin piecing together the truth. The momentum shifted as the airline's legal team called their witnesses. A flight attendant, carefully coached, painted a picture of Naomi as obstinate and confrontational. She raised her voice. The attendant claimed she refused to listen to instructions. It created a disturbance for the other passengers. Lisa rose for cross-examination, her steps deliberate as she approached the stand. "Ms. Peterson," she began, her voice steady. "How long have you worked for this airline?" 7 years, the attendant replied. "And in those 7 years," Lisa continued, "how many times have you witnessed a first-class passenger being forcibly removed from their seat?" The attendant faltered. I can't recall." "Because it doesn't happen, does it?" Lisa pressed. "Not unless the passenger poses a clear threat to safety." "Was Dr. Carter a threat?" "No," the attendant admitted reluctantly. Lisa stepped closer. "Then why was she removed?" The silence that followed was deafening. The day's most damning testimony came from an unexpected source. A former airline employee, subpoenaed by Lisa's team, took the stand. A young black woman with a quiet intensity. She introduced herself as Dana Wells, a former gate agent who had worked for the airline for 5 years. Ms. Wells, Lisa began, can you describe your experience working for this airline? Dana hesitated, then spoke. It was challenging, especially as a black woman. There were times when it felt like we were held to a different standard than our white colleagues. Can you elaborate? Lisa asked. Dana nodded, her voice gaining strength. There were subtle things, comments, assumptions, the way certain passengers were treated differently based on how they looked. And there were moments when it wasn't subtle at all. Did you ever witness incidents of racial bias? Lisa asked. Yes, Dana said firmly. And when I reported them, I was ignored or worse, retaliated against. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The airline's legal team visibly uneasy. Lisa allowed the noise to settle before delivering her next question. And in your experience, she asked, was Captain Thompson ever involved in these incidents? Dana's jaw tightened. Yes, he had a reputation for being dismissive of certain passengers, especially black passengers. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. The airline's attorney objected, but the judge allowed Dana's testimony to stand. Her words were a crack in the carefully constructed armor of the airline's defense. A crack that threatened to grow wider with every passing moment. By the time Naomi returned home that evening, she felt the exhaustion deep in her bones. But as she stepped into her apartment, she was greeted by the sight of her father and Lisa, both sitting at her dining table, their expressions a mix of pride and determination. You did well today, Lisa said as Naomi set down her bag. It doesn't feel like enough, Naomi admitted. They're still trying to twist this to make it about me instead of what really happened. That's what they do, Marcus said. But today, we made them uncomfortable. And that's how change starts, by making people see the truth, even when they'd rather look away. Naomi nodded, her resolve hardening. She thought of Dana's testimony, the way her words had cut through the room like a blade. This wasn't just about proving what had happened to her, it was about exposing the larger, uglier truth that so many people wanted to ignore. The chapter ends with Naomi sitting alone at her desk, staring at the growing stack of notes and documents that chronicled her fight. Outside, the city hummed with life, its lights twinkling like distant stars. She felt the weight of the battle pressing down on her. But she also felt something else, a spark, a quiet but unrelenting fire. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And Naomi Carter was prepared to see it through to the end. The courtroom was a furnace of anticipation as the trial reached its final week. Outside, the protests swelled, voices reverberating against the stone facade of the courthouse. Signs demanding accountability and justice waved in the air like restless beacons. Naomi Carter stood in the courthouse corridor, her father at her side. The energy around them was electric, charged with the hope of those who had rallied behind her, but also fraught with the weight of expectation. Inside, the legal teams were ready. The airline's attorneys wore their tailored suits like armor, their expressions guarded and sharp. Across from them, Lisa Morgan flipped through her notes with a calm precision that belied the storm brewing beneath. And Naomi, seated at the table beside Lisa, was the eye of that storm, resolute, unyielding. The first witness of the day was Captain Rick Thompson himself. His appearance on the stand was the climax the courtroom had been waiting for. The moment when the man at the center of it all would finally be forced to answer for his actions. He sat stiffly, his once commanding presence now dulled by weeks of scrutiny. Lisa rose, her steps deliberate as she approached the stand. Captain Thompson, she began, her voice steady but carrying a sharp edge. You've testified that your actions were in the interest of maintaining order on the flight. Can you explain what specifically led you to believe Dr. Carter posed a threat to that order? Thompson shifted in his seat, his discomfort evident. She refused to comply with my instructions, he said. And those instructions were? Lisa pressed. To leave the seat, Thompson replied, his tone defensive. There was confusion about her ticket. Lisa arched an eyebrow. Confusion that could have been resolved by simply looking at the ticket she presented. Why didn't you do that? Thompson hesitated, his eyes darting toward his attorney. I didn't think it was necessary. Lisa pounced. You didn't think it was necessary because you had already decided she didn't belong there. Hadn't you? Objection. The airline's attorney barked. Argumentative. Sustained, the judge said, her tone firm. Ms. Morgan, rephrase. Lisa nodded. her gaze never leaving Thompson. "Captain Thompson, did you make any effort to verify Dr. Carter's claim that the seat was hers?" "No," he admitted quietly. "Why not?" Lisa asked. Thompson didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, the weight of it pressing on everyone in the room. Finally, he said, "I don't know." Lisa stepped closer, her voice rising. "You don't know? Or is it because you made an assumption, a baseless, discriminatory assumption about Dr. Carter's right to occupy that seat?" "Objection," the airline's attorney repeated. But this time the judge allowed the question to stand. Thompson's face flushed. "I wasn't thinking about race," he said, his voice defensive. Lisa's eyes narrowed, maybe not consciously, but the result was the same. "Wasn't it? You saw Dr. Carter, a black woman sitting in first class. And instead of seeing a paying customer, you saw someone who didn't belong." The tension in the room was palpable as Thompson stepped down, his testimony leaving more questions than answers. Naomi watched him return to his seat, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor. She felt a fleeting pang of something close to pity but quickly pushed it aside. He had wielded his authority carelessly, and now he was facing the consequences. The trial's closing arguments were a battle of wills. The airline's attorney framed the incident as a regrettable misunderstanding, a moment of poor judgment rather than systemic bias. "Captain Thompson made a mistake," he said, addressing the jury, "but mistakes are human. This trial is not about condemning a man for a single error. It is about recognizing that no harm was intended and that the airline is committed to learning from this incident." Lisa rose for her closing argument, her voice steady but imbued with an urgency that filled the room. "This case is not about a single mistake," she began. "It's about a pattern, a system that allows people in positions of power to act on bias without accountability. Captain Thompson's actions were not isolated, they were a symptom of a larger issue. One that impacts people like Dr. Carter every day." She turned to the jury, her gaze sweeping across them. "You've seen the evidence. You've heard the testimonies. Dr. Carter was humiliated, dismissed, and forcibly removed from a seat she had every right to occupy, not because of a mistake, but because of an assumption rooted in prejudice. This isn't just about justice for Dr. Carter. It's about sending a message that this kind of behavior will no longer be tolerated." The jury deliberated for hours, the courthouse buzzing with speculation. Naomi sat with her father and Lisa in a quiet corner, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every second felt like an eternity, the outcome hanging in the balance. Finally, the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled quickly, the air thick with anticipation as the judge read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Captain Rick Thompson, guilty of discriminatory conduct and assault. Furthermore, we find the airline liable for fostering a culture that allowed such actions to occur." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by murmurs and whispers. Naomi felt a surge of relief, the tension she had carried for weeks finally beginning to lift. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers as the news spread. Naomi stepped onto the steps, the sun warm on her face, the weight of her victory settling over her. Reporters swarmed her, their questions overlapping, but she held up a hand, silencing them. "This is not just my victory," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is a victory for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. For everyone who has ever been dismissed, disrespected, or diminished because of who they are. The fight isn't over, but today, we've taken a step forward. And we won't stop until justice is not the exception, but the rule." The crowd roared, their voices echoing through the streets. Naomi looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many not, but all united by a shared determination. This was more than a personal triumph. It was a moment of reckoning, a turning point in a fight that was far from finished. And Naomi Carter was ready for whatever came next. The days following the verdict were a whirlwind, a storm of media coverage, public debates, and personal reflection. Naomi Carter found herself thrust into a spotlight she hadn't sought but could no longer avoid. The courthouse steps where she had declared victory became a meeting ground for activists, journalists, and ordinary people who had seen themselves in her story. Inside her apartment, Naomi sat at her dining table, surrounded by letters and emails printed by her assistant. Each one was a thread in a tapestry of solidarity and pain. Stories from black mothers teaching their children how to survive encounters with authority. From young professionals battling invisible barriers. From strangers who saw her fight as a glimmer of hope in a weary world. One letter in particular caught her eye. It was written in neat cursive on thick stationery. Dr. Carter. It began. I am a retired teacher. 74 years old. I've seen the world change. And I've seen it stay the same. Your courage reminded me of the marches I walked in during the 60s. And the promises we thought we'd secured. Thank you for reminding me that the fight isn't over and that it's worth fighting still. Naomi read the letter twice. Then set it down, her chest tight with emotion. It wasn't just about her. It had never been just about her. But not everyone celebrated her victory. The backlash was swift and unrelenting. Cable news networks hosted pundits who dissected the case with calculated detachment. This sets a dangerous precedent. One commentator argued, are we really saying every uncomfortable interaction has to be a racial issue? Social media became a battlefield, with supporters clashing against detractors who accused Naomi of overreacting, of seeking attention, of destroying a man's career. Naomi scrolled through the comments, her stomach twisting at the venom aimed at her. She knew it wasn't personal, not entirely. She had become a symbol. And symbols invited projection, both good and bad, but knowing that didn't make it easier. Her father, Marcus, found her that evening sitting on the couch, her phone forgotten beside her. He handed her a cup of tea, his expression a mix of pride and concern. You can't read everything they say about you, he said gently, sitting beside her. I know, Naomi replied, her voice low, but it's hard to ignore. Marcus nodded. You've done something they can't ignore. Naomi. That's why they're afraid. And fear makes people lash out. But don't let their fear shrink you. Naomi met his gaze, his words a steadying force. She took a sip of tea, feeling some of the tension in her shoulders ease. I'm not going to shrink, she said quietly. I just wish it didn't have to feel so lonely. Marcus placed a hand on hers. You're not alone. You've got a whole world standing with you even if they're not all in the same room. The airline, now in full damage control mode, released a second statement. This time, it was more than the usual corporate apology. They announced new training programs for employees, partnerships with organizations focused on diversity and inclusion, and an independent review of their policies. It was an attempt to salvage their reputation. But Naomi knew better than to take it at face value. She and Lisa had already begun drafting their next steps. The lawsuit had been a victory. But it was only one battle. Naomi wanted systemic change that would ripple beyond one airline, beyond one industry. At the first meeting with her legal team post-trial, Lisa laid out a plan. We have momentum, she said. People are listening. If we push for legislative reform, we could make real progress. Naomi leaned forward, her mind racing. Reform won't come easy, she said. There'll be resistance at every step. There always is, Lisa replied with a small smile. But that's never stopped you before. Weeks later, Naomi found herself back in Washington, D.C., sitting before a congressional subcommittee on corporate accountability. The room was filled with lawmakers, their faces a blend of skepticism, interest, and politeness. Cameras rolled as she began to speak, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Discrimination doesn't announce itself, she said. It doesn't always look like a slur or an overt act. Sometimes it's quieter, more insidious, a look, an assumption, a decision made in the moment that tells you, without words, that you don't belong. She paused, letting her words settle, but the impact is no less damaging. And the systems that allow these moments to happen unchecked and unchallenged are just as guilty as the individuals who perpetuate them. Naomi laid out her vision for change: stricter oversight of corporate policies, mandatory training programs with measurable outcomes, and a public reporting system for incidents of bias. It was ambitious, and she knew it would face fierce opposition. But as she spoke, she saw nods of agreement from some of the lawmakers, and she felt a spark of hope. That night, as Naomi returned to her hotel room, she stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. The day had been a step forward, but she knew there were many more steps to take. She thought of the letter from the retired teacher, the voices in the crowd outside the courthouse, the quiet strength of her father's words. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight inherited from those who had come before her and a responsibility to those who would come after. Naomi sat down at the desk, pulled out a notebook, and began to write. She didn't know where the words would take her. But she knew they were important. They always were. The fight wasn't over. And Naomi Carter was just getting started. The hall was full. Rows upon rows of people, from young activists to seasoned leaders, sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mosaic of determination and hope. Naomi Carter stood backstage, the low hum of conversations filtering through the heavy velvet curtains. She could feel the weight of their expectation, their belief, and it settled over her like a mantle. This wasn't just a speech. It was the culmination of months of struggle, a fight that had taken her from humiliation on an airplane to courtrooms, media outlets, and now to a national summit on racial equity. Her name had become synonymous with the movement. And the fight was no longer just about her. It never had been. "Are you ready?" Lisa Morgan asked, standing beside her with a clipboard in hand. Lisa's usually sharp demeanor had softened, her pride evident in her eyes. Naomi nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "As ready as I'll ever be." Lisa smiled. "Good. They're waiting for you." The room fell silent as Naomi stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking against the polished wood. She stood at the podium, scanning the crowd. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting the silence settle, letting the moment breathe. "I want to begin," she said finally, her voice carrying through the room, "by telling you what I've learned, not just from my own experience, but from the stories I've heard since that day on the plane." She paused, gripping the edges of the podium. "I've learned that the systems we live in are not broken, they were built this way. They were built to exclude, to diminish, to divide. And when those systems are challenged, they fight back. They try to silence you, to make you question your own worth, your own humanity." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, the cadence of her words rising like a wave. "But I've also learned something else. I've learned that we are stronger than those systems. That our voices, when united, can shake the very foundations they're built on. And that change is not only possible, it is inevitable. As long as we are willing to fight for it." The room erupted in applause. But Naomi raised a hand, quieting them. "But the fight isn't easy," she said. "It requires more than courage. It requires endurance. It requires sacrifice. And it requires us to look at ourselves, to confront the biases we carry, to unlearn the lies we've been taught." The applause was louder this time, a thunderous acknowledgement of the truth she had spoken. Naomi stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding as she watched the crowd rise to their feet. Among them, she spotted her father, Marcus, clapping with a quiet pride that brought tears to her eyes. Later that evening, Naomi sat in a quiet corner of the summit's reception, her plate untouched. People approached her constantly, activists, community leaders, even politicians offering congratulations, asking for advice, sharing their stories. Each conversation was a reminder of how far the movement had come, and how far it still had to go. As the evening wound down, Marcus joined her, a glass of wine in his hand. "You did good today," he said, his voice warm. Naomi smiled faintly. "It still feels like there's so much left to do." "There always is," Marcus said, "but you've started something, and starting is the hardest part." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. "Do you think it'll ever be enough? Do you think we'll ever get there?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not in our lifetime," he said finally. "But every step you take makes it easier for the ones who come after you. And that's how change happens, one step at a time." In the months that followed, Naomi's fight expanded. The legislation she had pushed for began to gain traction, forcing corporations to reevaluate their policies and practices. The airline, under mounting pressure, implemented sweeping reforms. Though Naomi knew it was only the beginning, she traveled across the country, speaking at colleges, churches, and community centers, amplifying voices that had long been silenced. And while the road was long, every victory, no matter how small, reminded her why she had chosen to fight. The chapter ends with Naomi standing in her father's study, looking at an old photograph on his desk. It was of Marcus as a young man, marching in a civil rights protest, his face lit with the same determination she now carried. "You've come a long way," Marcus said, stepping into the room. "So have you," Naomi replied, turning to face him. "And we're not done yet." "No," Marcus agreed, "we're not." The two stood together, their silhouettes framed by the soft glow of the desk lamp. Outside, the city buzzed with life, a reminder that the world was still turning, still changing. And Naomi Carter, with her fire undimmed, was ready to keep pushing it forward.